Hello and welcome to the One Life Church devotional series as we cover the entire Bible in 20 months. Well, today we're just reading one chapter, the very last of 2 Samuel, chapter 24. I'm walking up the back end of Table Mountain here and I've been reflecting on this verse because there's a lot in it. It brings a climax to David's leadership, his rulership, his ministry. And at the very center of the plot today is a threshing floor of a guy called Ornan. Now, Ornan had the threshing floor. Now, a threshing floor, you'll find threshing floors all over the Bible. This is basically what it was, a hard piece of ground where farmers would put their grain and they would allow the wind to blow across. Animals would trample on the grain so it smashes up the grain. And then they would take a winnowing fork, toss it in the sky, and the chaff would blow away. In Psalm 1, the psalmist says, the wicked are like chaff that are blown away. Jesus, when he spoke about judgment, said that he was like, the judge was like a farmer with a winnowing fork, separating the grain from the chaff, which would just be burned up. And so what happens in this particular story is that David sins. He counts his fighting men, takes 9 months to count his fighting men. The prophet Gad comes to him and says to him, listen, you shouldn't have done what you did. There's judgment coming. Judgment's going to be in one of three ways. Either you're going to be running from your enemies for 3 months, or there's going to be a drought for 3 years, or God's going to bring a plague for 3 days. David says, listen, I'll take my chances with God. He's merciful. And a plague sweeps across Israel. 70,000 people died. David's pleading before God. He's conscience stricken. And then at a threshing floor of a guy called Ornan, God says enough is enough. You know the incredible thing? If you read further in Scripture, 2 Chronicles 3 verse 1 says, that threshing floor was where God picked the point for Solomon to build his temple, where God was going to visit his people, where God was going to graciously come upon his people and his glory would be present there at this threshing floor. You see, judgment and redemption are things you've got to look at together. All of us are headed along a way where we'll be tossed like chaff, where we would go the way of the world. But God intervened with his son, didn't he? He intervened just like in the times of David. He graciously put the brakes on. No more judgment. He says that over you when he sends Jesus and he says no more judgment over their sin. You know the response to David when God stops at that threshing floor? His response is that I'm going to buy that threshing floor. I'm going to build a massive altar here. I'm going to thank God. The guy Ornan says to him, hey, listen, I'm going to give you this threshing floor. David says, there's no ways. I'm going to sacrifice to God something that doesn't cost me anything. You see, he didn't earn God's mercy, did he? He didn't earn God's mercy. No. At that threshing floor, God demonstrated his mercy. And after that demonstration, he was filled with gratitude. And he said, God, I need you. I want you. I love you. And God says, it's on that place I'm going to put my temple. If you wind back, you say, God, it's a bit rough that he was judged for counting his men. Now, Scripture makes it very clear that, firstly, the Levites shouldn't have been counted as fighting men, and Joab refuses to count them because we're trusting God to defend us, and let's allow worship to continue and our spiritual lives to march on in God's presence. The other thing that it tells us is that God said, I will increase your number, but David wasn't really believing that, was he? I don't know that he's given me enough soldiers to fight with. And so he was relying on his own strength. Now this is a tragic end to the ministry of David. But in one sense, it's also a glorious end. David comes to an understanding that God's mercy, he says, God's mercy and his grace, it needs to be celebrated. It needs to be more than applauded. Everything, it's worth paying a price to thank God for his intervention in our lives. So that's the end of 2 Samuel. And tomorrow we begin the book of Kings, the changeover of leadership, from David to Absalom.